As Tashi has said, actually, Dharamsala and the Tibetan community here and the library and the Amne Machen Institute have played a very, very large role in my formation in Tibetan studies. And indeed, in my early years, I was often at the library, and I would use the resources of the library to work. And so I'm very pleased and very happy whenever I come back here, and I'm very thankful that people still invite me to speak when I come back here. I know this is a particularly sad time for the community here and for the Tibetan communities elsewhere, as far as into Tibet as well. So I appreciate all of you coming today, and I don't forget, the sadness which afflicts so many of you here today. I'm somewhat surprised to see so many of you, because I checked the announcement when the announcement for the lecture was made, and only later on did I realize that only my name and topic were in English, and the venue and place were not. And I see there are some non-Tibetan readers, I think, maybe not here. The other thing is that the advertisement, the announcement was placed with all of the other advertisements up in McLeod Ganj and around here. So I hope nobody thinks that I'm running for Chitu. Because, well, if you want to vote for me for Chitu, by all means go ahead, but I think there are some rules which would preclude my standing. So, thank you all very much, and I'm going to give a short talk about the Tibetan armies of the 17th and 18th centuries, and I'm really going to stick to the 17th and 18th centuries. So, and I expect to speak for maybe 30, 40, 45 minutes or so, and after which I will certainly accept comments, questions, critique, whatever you will. Okay. Okay, it's not surprising that when one looks for information on military service in Tibet during the pre-modern era, one finds little in the way of analysis and secondary research. The fact is there are very few studies of Tibetan military history. Those that are available in Tibetan and Chinese are mostly concerned with battles, campaigns, and perhaps military movements. The question of where the Tibetan armies came from, how military levies were created, how military service in Tibet was managed are rarely mentioned, and we're still only vaguely cognizant of how Tibetans created or constituted fighting units in Tibet. And I guess I should assure everybody that, yes, Tibetans did fight, and they had armies, and they won. Sometimes they lost. The manner in which Mongols participated in fighting units in Tibet is also only superficially examined. The materials for a study of these topics really do need to be assembled still. Using some extant narratives, including important texts such as the Miwang Tokcha, some gazetteers of the Qing period, we can begin to flesh out the basic elements of the subject. And I hope that eventually we can come to a preliminary understanding of the organization and development of military service in Tibet in the early Ganden Pojang era. Among the few studies of Tibetan military history that we can cite are, and I hope this is readable, Xizang Gujin Dai Zhunshi Yanqiu Lunwen Xuan, which is a collection of articles edited by Tibetan Chashi, as you can see, Tibetan Chashi, and Yang Yonghong. Then there's Zhongguo Zhangjun by Liao Li, which translates as the Army of China's Tibet, or China's Tibet Army. Pujungye Kapchembe Silok Dangdrawe Jakbe Maki Logyo Rakdu by Gyanse Namgye Wangdu. And Pögye Kapki Chapsi Dangdrawe Makdun Logyu, which is a more extensive work by the same author, and it is available in English translation as Political and Military History of Tibet. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I saw copies of this outside on the table. So,
not free.
oh yeah, of course, or or I should say for a reasonable donation, which includes the cover price plus something. And then finally, 清代早期张文珍系文献，张输入兵士的历史及学术价值谈析。Which is by Chunpei or Chumpel in Tibetan, Sun Lin and Zhang Yuefan, which would translate as early Qing Tibetan, rare Tibetan documents on the military registers of the four horns of Tsang. That Tsang is in Yuzhang. And its scholarly value, an investigation of its scholarly value. So these are just a few of the things which we have on Tibetan military history. The two Tibetan language studies by Gyensei Namgyel Wangju essentially validate the description I just gave before. They provide an account of military milestones, battles, victories and defeats, and they are disproportionately concerned with the events of the 20th century. So again, you know, the origins and the early organization, well, I shouldn't say origins because if we're talking about Tibetan military history, of course, we have to go back to the imperial period, for which we do have some very interesting sources. But here for the Ganden Pojang period, really we don't have that much to tell us not simply about battles, but about how the army worked, how it operated. So, as I said, Gyensei Namgyel Wangju's works, which are useful but nevertheless are concerned mostly with the 20th century, don't really cast that much light, or as much as we would want, on the early Ganden Pojang period. The collection of articles, which is the last work, the work at, oh no, I'm sorry, it's the first work there. That collection of articles is broader, and it includes essays dealing with military affairs during the Qing period. But most of the relevant content really deals with the deployment, stationing, and supplying of Qing, not Tibetan, but of Qing troops. The Tibetan forces enter into the picture when, for instance, one of the articles discusses the need to reward the soldiers under Miwang Pola. This is Polane, the famous Pola Sonam Topge. Yue Zhongqi, who is the Governor General of Shanxi and who is in Tibet to observe the events in an official capacity, is quoted in a memorial, that is an official request of the Qing court, requesting that troops be appropriately rewarded for their merit in vanquishing Pola's foes in the 1727-1728 strife, which some of you may know resulted from the assassination of Kang Chene. And I should add that Yue Zhongqi became a particularly important figure in later years when he was a confidant of the Qianlong Emperor, a very intimate confidant of the Qianlong Emperor. And of course that strife that I talk about is the strife for which Ngape, Lumpane, and Jarawa were brutally executed. This is, I think, a well-known story, and it's been told also in Luciano Petek's China and Tibet in the early 18th century. The memorial by Yue Zhongqi lists Polonaise troop strength, and he calls them Fanbin, you know, Tibetan troops. So, although I don't know if they were necessarily all Tibetan troops, to be quite frank, because there is a large number of Mongols who are integrated in with the Tibetans. I have elsewhere described this period as Tibet's second Mongol century, except that it was in many ways a joint Tibeto-Mongol enterprise. One can say that about the construction of Ganden Pojang, given the Mongol component there, but it was not so clearly divided that here you have Mongols and here you have Tibetans. Indeed, a lot of the military was Tibeto-Mongol. One shouldn't just think of these as Khoshot soldiers. There were Tibetans with them as well, even Tibetans in commanding positions. I'll say something more about that. So we're told that Polane had 9,000 men, And then it is said that 200,000 silver liang would be needed to provide a suitable reward for these 9,000 men. And the rest of the memorial discusses that, those of you who have bureaucratic positions will appreciate, discusses where the money's to come from, how it's to be procured, and how it's to fit into the budget. The last of these works, the one at the very bottom, stands out from the others. It is a study of a set of books dealing with military affairs in Tsang that range over the 16th and 17th centuries. Taken collectively, the authors of the study, not of the registers, but the authors of the studies give the set a name that we can translate as Military Register of the Four Horns of Tsang. Tsang Suru, Ru is a transcription of Ru. The Four Horns of Tsang, Tsang Suru, a military register of them. The contents, as we will see, impart significant information regarding military service in that region. But let me start from the previous observation, and that is to say we can begin to understand something of the ways in which Polonais' army was constructed. There's a general impression of the Tibetan military prior to the attempt to create a modern military in Tibet after the Qing collapse, that is in the 20th century. There's an impression that derives from the general concept of ula in Tibetan society, that all of this was just ula. That's what the Tibetan army was, people fulfilling military corvée or military tax. And it is generally accepted that military service was a tax obligation imposed on the Tibetan peasantry. This is not wrong, but at the same time, the idea that Polonais wielded an army that fought with the notion that they would be amply rewarded was a fact that cannot be dismissed. In other words, the soldiers were rewarded. In reality, the society of central Tibet in the 17th and 18th century was very much influenced by and permeated by the Mongol presence in the country. Much of the military operating at the time did so on the model of the Khoshot, who had entered Tibet and ensured the triumph of the Ganden Pojang regime. This is what we see in the memorial from Yuezhongqi, and I should add that the Pola family had long been part of the military organization in Tibet at that time, going back to previous generations before Polonais, at least 2 generations before then. The use of Tibetan peasantry on the basis of ula is indicated. In other words, that was one of the ways in which soldiers were raised. But there was also, as I tend to think, a real military caste coming from the Mongol presence that was there in Tibet. So, this is from Pola's biography. It's an interesting incident. It is when there was a discussion of stationing troops in Tibet by the Qing court. And this is after the 1727-1728 troubles. So if I may, I'm sure most of you are reading this, but I'll give a translation for those who are not. Then, as for the behavior of evil beings in Tibet, behavior that was bringing ruin to themselves and others, it was consistently difficult to differentiate enemies or friends, their natures unsteady and vacillating. Because there have been such sorts of evil actions on their part that go against the dicta of the great sovereign emperor, thoughts turn to reproach. And after the emperor's chief military leaders conferred together, they decided to install a force of 10,000 soldiers in Lhasa alone. If one asks as to how this affected the Lord of Men, that is Miwang Pola, he became depressed, and with a troubled mind he said, and this is what he said to the representatives of the emperor, leaders, please understand, for beings in general, and for us Tibetan subjects in particular, the great ruler is the peerless refuge and protector. And he's referring to the emperor, the Qing emperor. Thus, we Tibetan subjects, out of apprehension of destruction and apprehension of defeat, for our own sake, the order stating that 10,000 troops are to be placed here in this land is truly an unrepayable kindness. He's being quite ironic. He doesn't mean it. And he gets to the point right afterwards. Moreover, And however, as for paying the price for food, implements and utensils, firewood, horses, and fodder, one understands the marvelous intention to preserve the happiness of the subjects. And yet, Tibet is a small country, inferior in wealth, there being no difference between those serving as troops and those fulfilling tax duties. All military taxes fulfilled by each household, and it is nothing but pitiful. Thus, although the great ruler's troops and the monies and wealth of the storehouses would not be exhausted, this country is poor, and he means the wealth of the Qing would not be exhausted. This country is poor in tools and materials, and in only a year or two, the subjects would have no choice but to forsake the country and wander about like wild animals. Truly, 10,000 troops could not be placed here. There is a lot of rhetorical work going on here. Of course, starting off by saying what a great kindness that you're going to send 10,000 troops, and then ending up by saying that nevertheless, there's no way that we could support 10,000 troops here, that we could fulfill all their needs, as he mentions, food, implements, utensils, firewood, horses, and fodder. And so he made this a request with great earnestness, and the chief officials discussed this for a long time and said, well then, we'll make it 5,000. So he got it down to 5,000. And I guess while I said I was not going to mention the 20th century, one might recall the difficulties in the very beginning of the 1950s with stationing PLA troops in Tibet as well, that was a considerable hardship. Later on, there are other rhetorical touches. Polanyi goes on to cite the misery inflicted on Tibetans by the strife between Sangye Gyatso and Lasan Khan as an added mitigating factor. Now, there's also an earlier reference in Polanyi's biography to the burden of military tax as it was born during the Dungar War. And so we are told, at that time, as pertains to the subjects in the merchant class, etc., in Sang, having fulfilled all of the activities of battle and the stages of taxation, some were suffering and immiserated. Even after taking on loans for implements and utensils, the difficult fulfillment of the stages of military service and taxes had rendered them exhausted and weary. Some of the subjects, though, they had become wealthy and had fulfilled little more than a bit of the stages of military service and taxes and comported themselves freely, going about far and wide. After seeing the lives and limbs of the subjects of one lord treated in different ways without reason, Polanyi took measures to safeguard the low and wretched ones for whom the stages of military tax were reduced, while for those made arrogant by power and wealth, the stages of military tax were made heavy. So these passages give a reasonable description of some of the elements of military service, particularly the widespread impact of military taxation in 18th century Tibet. But there is, and at a time of war, I should add, but there's another element that I've referred to, worth examining, and it derives from the curious position of Tibet during this period, a period in which there was a significant Mongol element in the political and military structure of Tibet. I've written about this elsewhere, so some of you may have seen some of this. I would posit that the support of Mongol troops is in part what is to be understood by the reference to the other stages of taxation and other taxes. That is, tax was, the military corvée meant not just serving in the army, it also meant supporting the army. In other words, the taxes imposed upon the peasantry for horses, for fodder, for food, all of these things. And it was, it included, as I said, utensils, fodder, and also supplemental labor. That includes doctors, camp workers, etc. This was all part of the taxes that were needed to support the Tibetan army. Those of you, I think this should be clear for those of you who could read this. I'll allude to all of these points right now. So I've noted something about the composition of the forces of Kangchene, the close comrade in arms of Polanyi during the Jungar War. Kangchene commanded Mongols. Again, one can't really dismiss this fact. And as I've said elsewhere, this early Gannon Pojang period in many ways was a Tibeto-Mongol construction. And as I've argued elsewhere, Tibet at this point, and when Polanyi talks about the great emperor, meaning the Qing emperor, you have to understand he's talking about this Manchu-Mongol world of which Tibet was a part. Tibet was very much a part of the Mongol world. As I've said, the period from the mid-17th century to the mid-18th century can in many ways be considered Tibet's second Mongol century. Now, this is quite different from saying, although if the sources and the facts led me to this conclusion, I would certainly not hesitate to say it. But it does not mean that Tibet was a part of China at this point. I'm talking about a Tibeto-Mongol world, which is even further expanded into the world of into a Manchu-Mongol world, of which Tibet is wrapped up in, which in some ways leads into Tibet being rolled up into the beginnings of what I tend to consider hints and signs of modernity, which, a little plug here, there'll be a roundtable on that on the 11th here as well. If somebody wants to, if somebody does not feel that they've been punished enough by coming to listen to me speak today. I'm really talking about a Manchu-Mongol world of which Tibet is a part. And the Qing is an empire. In fact, I don't, maybe I shouldn't get into this too much here, but there is a debate. It's not really a debate outside, although Chinese scholars have now been pushing back on this, and this is the question of new Qing studies, which is the way that people tend to look upon the Qing. That is, the Qing is a Manchu empire in the same way that the Yuan dynasty is a Mongol empire. It is not a Chinese empire, it is a Manchu empire. And this is generally accepted outside the People's Republic of China. Inside the People's Republic of China, it is adamantly, how shall I say, argued against. Kang Chene, the close comrade of arms of Polanyi, in the aftermath of the strife that forms the background to Polanyi's discussion of how many Qing troops could be supported in Tibet, there is a report about the disposition of the Mongols, the Oirat, the Western Mongols, that includes the Khoshot. The Khoshot or Oirats. There's a report about the disposition of Oirat Mongols, including troops who had previously been under Kang Chene's command and were subsequently leaderless following his assassination. In effect, it reflects the fact that the Khoshot military presence in Tibet was an important factor that needs to be looked at in assessing the disposition of military forces in the country at the time. Yue Zhongqi, again, as I said, he's rather important, in a memorial for April 12, 1728, was apprehensive about these Oirats because the implication of having these Oirat soldiers with no commander wandering around seemed to be extremely dangerous. According to his memorial, they were exploring several options. Some were considering surrendering to Polanyi, or going over to Polanyi, I should say, because Polanyi and Kang Chene were allies. Some were considering submitting to the Dalai Lama, and some even submitting to Sonam Dorje, the Dalai Lama's father, and one of the lead conspirators in the killing of Kang Chene. Yue Zhongqi stated, following this instance of pacifying Tibet, it would seem inconvenient to continue to leave these kinds of Oirats in Tibet. As they multiply, they will present problems for the future. Indeed, there appears to have been certain expectations on the part of the Oirat soldiers. Another earlier memorial reported that Kang Chene had been denounced during the investigation. This is when the Amban is when the Qing authorities are investigating the assassination of Kang Chene before the execution of the three main conspirators that I mentioned. The conspirators minus Sonam Dorje, the Dalai Lama's father, who is considered also, if I can go back to, the administration of Richard Nixon, the unindicted co-conspirator. in this earlier memorial, he writes that the conspirators denounced Kangchenay, saying that he had been extracting excessive official funds to give to his soldiers. The figure mentioned was 200,000 liang. That is, he was claiming to have more soldiers than he actually had and taking money from the Qing. So this goes back even before the activity of the CIA in the 1950s and 60s in various places where there are ghost soldiers on rolls for whom the CIA gives money and nobody knows where the money goes. One has to conclude, all of this is contained here, one has to conclude, therefore, that the conditions of military service in Tibet were complicated during the 17th and 18th century. At least up to the first half of the 18th century, the Oirat Hosho troops were sort of a military caste, or so it would seem. When I say that, again, I'm being very, very broad because these soldiers included Tibetans. So they constituted a kind of professional caste. And when I say that Polanyi and Kangchenay had Oirats under their command, it makes for a much more complicated situation. Indeed, looking at what we have about Kangchenay, I sometimes tend to, and I don't mean to be flip about it, but I sometimes tend to look at it as a kind of mafia construction. That is to say, you have different crews, you take out you assassinate the head, and then the soldiers have to basically find somebody else to be their leader, to whom they can give their services. And this seems to be the concern of the Qing, that with Kangchenay dead, you had all of his troops now, wondering what they're going to do. You might even say, it's sort of what the Americans faced in Iraq when they took out Saddam Hussein or his regime, and then they had all of these armed soldiers wandering around, and there was, they might have benefited by reading one of these memorials, maybe. These Hoshots trained with the Tibetans, and under Gushri Khan, certainly, and Lasan Khan, they constituted an elite. And this is a description of the troops together. At that time, the ruler of men, and that's Lasan Khan, and his entourage, riding excellent mounts, went to the great happy groves of the Dam region. And after getting there, they passed the time enjoying all manner of games and amusements. Some atop horses, possessed of the force of clouds, fired arrows and firearms. Some, as a band of horsemen, fully surrounded both predators and animals of prey, caught them by their necks and tails, and firing arrows slew them. Some groups of Mongols, and groups whose lineage was that of the imperial rulers of Tibet, and you can see in the text it says Pudgel Purik. Some of them competed against each other as they played at games of infinite levels of skills, and there they dwelled, engaging in their competitions. If this were a different century, I might say these were war games. Certainly hunting was and hunting games was constituted one form of training for the military. Let me see now. Oh yeah, okay. At this point, I'm going to go out on a limb somewhat and speculate about the volume subsumed under the collective Chinese title that I mentioned for the first, in that first slide where I listed the different sources, the Military Register of the Four Horns of Tsang. It appears, insofar as I can tell from the description of its contents, and here I have to make a confession, I'm not working with the original text. I am working with a Chinese article from 2013 which describes these military registers. I have not seen them. I have not seen a Tibetan language article on them. There's only a Chinese language article on them. As I said, one of the authors is named Chunpei, and the article comes from the archives in Gyanse. If anybody has access to people in Tibet who work in the archives who know this, it would be wonderful to have this thing published. In fact, it's a desiderata. It's very necessary to have it published because all I have at this point is this Chinese description of it, a Chinese language description of it, and it clearly seems to be very important. Certainly the authors think it's important. It seems to give little or no attention to the Mongol military in Tibet and to deal only with Tsang. As I've said, the Mongol military is a significant part of the picture. certainly before the middle of the 18th century. And that may be because of the comments of the authors of the article on this volume. The authors claim that, I don't know if anybody here can read this, but if you read this, you're probably a little bit, I'm sure it's piqued your curiosity. The three authors, one Tibetan, two Chinese, unless one or both of the two Chinese names listed are actually Tibetan, because one does sometimes find Tibetans writing under Chinese names. But the authors claim that the compiler is none other than Desi Sangye Gyatso. And they date the compilation of these records to the year 1693. One wonders if Sangye Gyatso was so inclined to ignore references to Mongol power. Much more needs to be done on this score, and first and foremost, we need a copy of the original text. I will admit to you, this is really a secondary source. Worse than a secondary source, I mean, when I discuss this with you, I'm giving you a translation of a translation, really, in some of the elements that follow here, which is far from ideal, but it's the best that I can do at this point. Within this text, we're told that the basic organization of the army in Tsang, according to the one of the volumes in the compilation, which is titled Tsang Yunru Rutsun Serpo Sisum Sinon Depter. One of the basic organization is named as the Dingtso. The Dingtso is an amalgam of Ding and Tsochen, with the Ding being the basic unit. More or less equal to the platoon of a modern army, the Ding had 4 10-man units, including the commanders. Each Ding was organized with 40 soldiers, to which were added 5 reserve soldiers, making 45 altogether. And unfortunately, the quotation I'm going to give you now, I don't, for some reason or other, I omitted the slide, which has the, not the original text, but the Chinese translation. So please bear with me. And so it says, when examining the organization of people and households into Ding, the upper, middle, and lower level commoners, except for those already working the dun, which is the basic measure for land taxation, for the land that produced the grain for military tax, or for each zong, shi, etc., in order to supply military service, horse service, as well as servants belonging privately to households and the aristocracy. Aside from that, the rest who are doing government tax service, that is the monastic estates, aristocrats, daksen, high-ranking leaders, etc., each large and small household should support an amount of military corvée. And so this is an order that each household has to support a certain amount of military corvée, and the names of all their able-bodied men, their ages and economic circumstances, cultural level, and level of training of doctors, craftsmen, and the lands that they possess for the support of their subsistence and their production materials. All this needs to be classified, and it should be on the basis of the true state of affairs, truthful in description, and absolutely not muddled or misleading. I'm stopping in the middle of this just to point out that it's very complicated in society in the 17th and 18th century to constitute a military. People don't simply show up. There are all sorts of facilities which you need to have, including doctors and craftsmen. And also when there's a reference to the true state of affairs, truthful in description, and absolutely not muddled or misleading, clearly a lot of people cheated. I don't think you would see this sort of order or this sort of comment, except for the fact that a lot of the lists were not accurate, not true. And then he says, each area's Gyapen, Tsopen, Gina, or their agents must swear an oath that the investigation and recording of the numbers of support for military corvée, the names of all the Dingpen, Simchungpa, their physical strength, bravery, arrow skills, rifle methods, etc. All these military skills are to be divided by level and indicate by Sanskrit enumeration in each register with a record of other evidence. And with Sanskrit enumeration, I assume that this means Tibetan enumeration. Again, this is from a translation into Chinese. When the relevant regions together organize the Ding, they should fully consider wartime supplies, Tsampa transport, not just Tsampa, but how they're going to transport the Tsampa, the safeguarding of the army's rear, resupplies, all of these circumstances. From each 3 households there should be drawn 1 soldier. Thus 45 able-bodied men should be drawn from the 120 households to form 1 ding. Together 15 ding would be 1 tsochen, and there would be together 4 tsochen. Also there are also 2 ding especially designated to care for the iron, artillery, and the military tents. This is part of the organization that you have there. Again, it's not just, grab your gun and go out to fight. I think people sometimes get that impression when they look at the British accounts of the Young Husband expedition, particularly the battle at Guru, where the British seem to feel that the Tibetans just took whatever weapons they had, and they marched out there with very little training. Actually, it seems to be far more organized than one would otherwise think if one goes on the basis simply of 20th century, how shall I say, anecdotal accounts, really. The persistent references to oaths and verifications points to the phenomenon of persistent fraud. It was glaringly evident, so much so that the Weizang Tongzhi, which is one of the important Qing gazetteers for Tibet, produced in the 18th century, it makes mention of this in reference to military service in Tibet. And I'll translate the Tangut, and by the way, the Manchus often referred to the Tibetans as Tanguts. The Tangut fan soldiers had all along been dispatched using peasants from each zone. Whenever there was a relevant matter, they would be dispatched as troops. They had no command and no refinement. Although there were several tens of thousands of names, they were merely empty. Again, we just saw this reference previously to the need for everything to be absolutely accurate, people to swear oaths that there really are such soldiers serving when they take the monies that are supposed to be used for them. And according to the Weizang Tongzhi, this was a persistent problem. What I've given you today, is not systematic. I'll be the first to say it's not systematic. This is the beginning of our organizing, what materials we have on the way the Tibetan military operated. Not just the battles they fought, but the way they operated, the way they were organized. So now let me, for those of you who have fallen asleep during this talk, let me get to things sexual. People wake up now. So just one word on the social aspect of stationing Qing forces in Tibet. The sexual circumstances of men sent to serve by the Qing on the Tibetan plateau, like those of some Chinese merchants, meant that they formed relationships with local women in Tibet and ultimately formed families or otherwise fathered what is described in one account as a large number of children. In 1792, Doreng Tenzin Benjo traveled to Beijing to be investigated for his incompetence in the Gurkha War. He notes about his time en route in Chengdu. After arriving safely, I translate, in the great city of Chengdu in Sichuan, and while dwelling there for 3 days, Tibetan children who had been born in Tibet and then brought to China, who were of the families of Chinese merchants who had gone from this land to Tibet, and of military families who lived in the settlement in considerable numbers, on one day, out of love for their land, prepared an extensive Chinese-style feast for all of us Tibetans, and in connection with that, presented many marvelous Beijing opera spectacles. So this stationing of Qing troops in Tibet was not without, how shall I say, repercussions. And on that note of titillation, I've spoken for about 40 minutes now. And so as I promised, I will stop here and I will take questions, comments. I will answer as best I can. As I said, this is a subject that still has more questions than answers. So thank you very much for your attention.
During the 13th century, from the 13th century to the, we can see that within 13th century we have very much weak in the military because many times, for example, 19th century, we have a problem with other neighborhoods, but we always take help from the Manchu Empire or any Mongol Empire. So why we cannot make our own self to strong military? Okay,
well, thank you for the question. I've retired from my professorial position, but it doesn't mean that I will not go on endlessly digressing into different points. So I hope I will get to the answer. The fact is that the period of the Tibetan Empire represents not simply Tibetan power, but the greatest extent of Tibetan expansion, of Tibetan demographic expansion. Now, what I have to say is I've said it many times, it's very simplistic. And I say it simplistically, and it's something of an exaggeration in order to make a larger point, which is to say that you're dealing with a period in which the Tibetans, sort of like the Arabs, come into formation. And what I mean by that is the Arab Empire forms when you have a small group that explodes out of the Arabian Peninsula. And when the smoke and dust clears from the Atlantic Ocean to the Fertile Crescent, everybody is an Arab. Now, in terms of time and all of that, this is a bit of a simplification. I agree that, but you have a similar phenomenon where a small group explodes out of south-central Tibet, overruns the plateau, and spreads even beyond the plateau, so that when the smoke and dust clears, if you will, from the borders of Kashmir to the shores of the Koh-i-Noor, everybody is the descendant of a monkey bodhisattva and a rock ogress. Now, what I mean by that is the process of the formation of the Tibetans as a people. The demographic history of the Tibetans after that period is one of retraction. Not an awful lot, at least not until the modern period in the People's Republic of China. But for instance, if you look at places like the modern city of Linxia in Gansu, which is between Lanzhou and Labrang Tashikil, it was previously Hezhou, Gachu. And for many, many centuries, even into the Qing, it was still largely Tibetan. Today, of course, it's Hui. It is almost wholly Hui. And you have the same thing, the borders between Dungari and Ladakh and Kashmir. Now, but the retraction is, it's not great. It's not a massive loss, but it is still retraction. So one can say this, that one might say that you have this great period of power and expansion, and subsequently, Tibet really doesn't constitute a major military power. So it's not a loss of power after the Mongols. It is a loss of power before then. Now, in some ways, one might even say that this is fortuitous. Many years ago, we had a conference at Indiana on the Chinggisid legacy in Central Asia. And I was supposed to speak, but there were circumstances that came up and I couldn't attend. But nevertheless, the interesting thing is that in most of Central Asia, the Chinggisid legacy, that is the descent from Chinggis Khan, is very important. And you'll find many, many Turkic communities in Central Asia, where the name Chinggis is a very fine name to give to a child. Many people are named Chinggis. And the legitimacy of later rulers often hinged upon tracing their lineage back to Chinggis Khan. The interesting thing about Tibet during the Mongol period is this is not really the case. The prestige of the imperial lineage of the Tibetan rulers remain, not the prestige of Chinggis. And I generally tend to see this as a result of the fact that much of Central Asia was conquered by the Mongols, and the structures that were there were destroyed. The Tibetans weren't conquered, they surrendered. And so you didn't have this mass destruction. And the prestige of the emperors remained. When I talk about these quote-unquote war games, if you will, that the Oirats are playing with the Tibetans, this is Dokar Shaptun Tsering describing it, but he says, it's divided between, the Oirats and the, Purgyel Purik, which is a clear reference to the imperial lineage. And in fact, Doring Pandita, it's interesting. I mentioned that he's en route to Beijing to be investigated for being so incompetent in handling the Gurkha War. When he gets to Beijing and he's sitting there being investigated, one of the Qing officials said, what is this? What are you wearing? These earrings, and one is chiru, and one is yu, and he says, we wear the chiru, for Gushri Khan, who ruled us, who is from Tsongun, and we wear the yu for the emperors, our own emperors. And the Qing official makes some sort of a comment that maybe we should hang something on your nose to signify the Manchu Qing, or something like that. But and of course he's very nervous at the time. But this continues, this prestige of the early emperors. But the point that I'm getting at is that really, ultimately, Tibet is not a major military power after the imperial period of Phla Tsempel. That doesn't mean that you don't have Tibetan armies. And it doesn't mean that the Tibetans did not fight. Of course they did. And when you read some of the accounts, they fought very well, indeed. But they did not constitute an imperial power in that sense. And it's not just from the Mongol period. It's from the period afterward. Now, why? There are some people, and you can even read this with some people who are sympathetic to Tibet, they will say that after the imperial period, or during the imperial period, the Tibetans found Buddhism and gave up conquest and military and killing and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That, of course, is ridiculous. It did not happen. The Tibetans always had armies, and the Tibetans always fought. And this later became one of the complaints of the Mongols. The modern Mongols used to say that the Manchu Qing emperors basically tricked us. They forced Tibetan Buddhism on us so that we would no longer be these militant Mongols. Of course, this is not the case. The world changed. The world changed very much. And the Tibetans, who had constituted, a very important power, were not a power afterwards. When the Tibetan Empire collapsed, by the way, there was a lot of collapse in Eurasia. The Arab Caliphate began to split. The Tang dynasty also collapsed. It was followed by a division of, 5 dynasties. This is something which was happening all over. I don't have an absolute handy-dandy answer to this, but I hope I've indicated some of the complexities.
During the 8th His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we had 3,000 Tibetan military, which is namely Jajumagar or Chinese trained army. So my question is, who was giving those army training, by Chinese government or Tibetan, or by both of them?
Which period are you talking about?
I mean during the 8th His Dalai Lama. Yeah.
Clearly it was the Qing. And there are some references in some of the Qing gazetteers, to the training of Tibetan troops, which they considered to be quite inferior. But they did train some of them. And this was according to, Qing military tradition. There's sometimes a confusion between Qing and Chinese here. One has to understand that Tibet was part, and again, I'm not saying that, I don't want to get, into a controversial subject, but it shouldn't be controversial here, but the Qing never made Tibet a part of China. But it was a part of the Qing realm. And you have to understand the Qing realm is, this Manchu Empire, again, and Tibet, by its inclusion into a Manchu-Mongol realm, was part of that. So we're talking about Qing training here. Indeed, in the Weizang Tongzhi, there is reference to that as well, when they say that the Tibetan troops are poorly trained. And then they do take some and they train them.
When we look back, yes, these days many people, they, Pahlawa Sunatobje, they regard it as a hero of history of hero. My question is, sorry, maybe it's not connection with your topic, but it's very hard topic for me. So, what do you think about Pahlawa and his action and its result? when we study history, for me, his son, Wang Sirinam, is very sort of a hero for me. What do you think? What is the difference between his father's heritage, result, the work's result, and sense?
You mean Gyurme Namgyel? Yeah. You know, actually I'm going to say a little bit about that on the 11th, but as a sort of, you go to the movies and you see a little trailer which says, oh, come, let me just say a little something about that. I find Polanyi an extremely fascinating figure. Some of the things which happened during the time of Polanyi, as I say, Tibet, and I'll say this, I don't think Tibet was modern, but I think that there were indications of what might have become a modernity, and they relate to what was happening elsewhere in the world. The rule of Polanyi, the reign of Polanyi. Now, again, Polanyi was, his allegiance was to the Qing emperor. But he was nevertheless the most powerful person in Tibet in his time, and he was not a monk or a lama. It's a very interesting interlude of, if you will, secular rule in the middle of Ganden Pojang. It was fascinating. Now, again, when I say that, I don't mean that Polanyi was anti-religious or non-religious. Absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying. But things move by fits and starts, a little bit here, a little bit there. And what might have happened, I don't know, because, as we know, Gyurme Namgyel was killed, just a few years after, he began to rule. But he also represented a secular figure. In fact, a secular figure within this larger Manchu-Mongol realm. Polanyi, you read the colophon of, the Miwang Tokcha, and he is praised, not as in, the Namtar that you usually read, for a man of great vision and great spiritual experience, for the titles he gets from the Manchu emperor. And his biography recounts his military exploits, and he's praised for that. This represents something very interesting coming in the middle of Ganden Pojang. Because when people tend to read very simplistically Tibet's history, and you can see that, there's Dunkar Losong Chinle, when he wrote his Chusi Sungja Kwarshepa, he basically saw history, moving in an inevitable direction, like Hegel and Marx, and in which, ultimately you reach the apogee of this Chusi Sungja with Ganden Pojang. And that's why he ended his book, of course, in 1950. The story ends in 1950 because he didn't, I can understand why he didn't want to go beyond 1950 to 1959, but he really says, this is the apogee of, this Chusi Sungja. In the middle of that, to have the rule of Polanyi, I think, is very, very interesting. And Polanyi's rule, I should also say, represents the way I see Polanyi, a loyalist regime, loyal to Lasan Khan. Now, many people look upon Lasan Khan, and if you read a lot of books, Lasan Khan is a villain. He got rid of the 6th Dalai Lama, he had Sangye Gyatso killed, so he's looked upon as a villain. But when you read the history of the Pola family, they were very loyal to Lasan Khan. And the Pola regime, in that sense, is a continuation of this Tibeto-Mongol reign. Again, I've said, from the mid-17th to the mid-18th century, for me, represents the second, Tibet's second Mongol century. But not so much Tibet being subsumed under Mongol rule. It's really kind of a joint enterprise. And so Pola, in many ways, represents a loyalist regime, loyal to Lasan Khan. And his biography is very much full of that. Paul Netupsky wrote a very, very useful and very good book about Labrang Tashikil. At one point, he says, just in talking about general Tibetan history, that of course Losang Khan was, disliked by almost all Tibetans, etc., etc., etc. And when you read the Miwang Tokcha, you say, well, not all Tibetans were hostile to Losang Khan. It's a very complex issue, but yeah. So the question is, Polanyi and the death of Gyurme Namgyel. Those are really questions that I tend to look at in the sense of saying what might have been if Gyurme Namgyel had not been killed, if there had been a greater secular presence within the rule in Tibet. Indeed, what might have been if the Tibetans essentially had this kind of secular view that many of the Mongols had, the Mongols who served the Qing. If the Tibetans had had a similar sort of presence there. I don't know because the ironic thing is that the Mongols were far closer to the Manchus and to the Qing than the Tibetans. Geography, for one thing, was an element there, and yet it's the Mongols who wind up today with their own state. So I don't. These are questions. I don't really. I'm not going to give you an answer because there are 1,000,001 variables when you begin to talk about what might have been in history. So.
My question is about Tibet and Manchu relations, and you made a mention about it. The popular Tibetan narrative is that the Tibetans struck a deal with the Manchus and said that we will give you Buddhist teachings and you give us the protection. And the similar kind of narratives was also being made about Tibet and Mongolian relationship. And that's how we generally understand ourselves in this way. And you seem to point out to a different position here. So I wanted to know from you, my question is, from your side, and also internationally, how do the historians actually look at the nature of relationship between the Tibetans and the Manchus? And of course, here we need to make clear that Manchus were Manchurian Manchus, and their rule up to 1911, right, to the point that they were overthrown from the Chinese, from above the Chinese, and the Chinese creating their modern-day China. So, how do you look at it, and how do the historians from around the world look at this nature of relationship?
Oh, Tenzin Sundar, you asked such a question. I'll try to answer it as concisely as I can, because I know some people do intend to have dinner tonight and also breakfast tomorrow morning. But it has long been the position in the Tibetan exile community, and some of it derives from Tsepan Shakapa's history, and I have the utmost respect for Tsepan Shakapa. I did get to know him somewhat, and I really respect him very much. But this point is something that I would disagree on, which is that essentially the whole business of Tibet's status is as far as the rest of the world has seen it, is a result of a misunderstanding of the so-called priest-patron relationship, Chöyun. And what Shakapa said is that this is an Eastern concept which Westerners cannot understand, and therefore they believe that because of this priest-patron relationship, Tibet was therefore politically under China. And there are a number of things that I would take issue with. One is that, and I'm a humanist, I believe that we can all understand human culture. It differs. We have different views, but nothing is so strange that it is beyond human comprehension. And the idea that the priest-patron relationship is beyond human comprehension, I would not go there. Of course, if I may say so, I think that when Tsepan Shakapa was writing, he was writing at a time when people were not clear about the difference between the Qing and China, between Manchus and Chinese. Owen Lattimore once wrote that there was a great historical reversal. Always the inter-Asian empires that conquered China. Not just Mongols, not just Manchus, but the Turks, the Uyghurs in the Tang period marched in, the Tibetans who marched into the Tang capital. And he said there was a great reversal in the 19th century when the European powers essentially handed the Manchu Empire over to China by marking it as a Chinese empire on their maps, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, when the Europeans arrived on the Chinese coast, they found a very highly sinicized Manchu bureaucracy, still Manchu, but very highly sinicized. In the 19th century, certainly the late 19th century, most Manchus were far more capable in Chinese than they were in their own Manchu. But in Inner Asia, that hulking dinosaur of a Manchu empire still survived. There were limitations. Chinese were not supposed to serve as amban. And the Mongols were very much aware of that because they were part of the ruling structure. And of course, this was very obvious in Tibet as well. So it's not one doesn't have to be coy about trying not to give way to us the idea that the Chinese were ruling, but it was a priest-patron relationship, and therefore there's confusion about that. It was a Manchu empire, very much so. And indeed, if I may say so, during the revolutionary period in the early 20th century, before the Xinhai Gaming of 1911 and the Republic of China in 1912, revolutionaries in China, one of their cries was, down with the foreigners, and by which they meant the Manchus. And part of the narrative was that the Manchus had brought China down. Now, the fact is, if I say that, I'm not saying that Tibet was not part of the Qing Empire. It absolutely was. The priest-patron relationship and Tibetan domination by the Qing and being a dominion of the Qing are not mutually exclusive. You can have a priest-patron relationship where there is no political domination. Just to be very simple, look at the third Ming Emperor, the Yongle Emperor, Ming Chengzu, and the fifth Karmapa. Absolutely a priest-patron relationship, but no political domination. Has nothing to do with political domination. And then you have this during the Mongol period and during the Qing period where you do have political domination. So one really has nothing to do with the other. If you look at the Qing regulations from the Li Fanyuan, which by the way is often translated as Board of Colonial Dependencies. So clearly nobody is saying that Tibet was an integral part of China. It was a colonial dominion. But if you look at that, clearly the Qing did have authority over Tibet. And as I sometimes say, the 13th Dalai Lama proclaimed Tibet's independence. Now, nobody is in the habit of proclaiming their independence when they're already independent. So there was quite an understanding that, yes, they were under the Qing. And in fact, this was the representation that Tibetans would make to the British in India. No, we can't deal with you because we're under the Qing. But that political domination, so what I'm saying is that political domination and the priest-patron relationship, these are, mixing apples and oranges. But people tend to say, okay, yes, it's a misunderstanding of the priest-patron relationship. It was not. The other thing which I have to say, I'll be very brief again. As I say, I know you all have to go have dinner. Up until the mid-1950s, inside the People's Republic of China, nobody could decide when Tibet I shouldn't say they did decide. Later on, they get confused. But Chinese writers, up into the 1950s, when they talked about Tibet becoming a part of China, Chinese writers would date it to 1792, 93, and the promulgation of the various regulations, which now give us the headache of the Golden Urn and all of that. In other words, this is when Chinese writers would date it to. This whole idea that Tibet became a part of China during the Mongol period in the 13th century, it's not there. And I've written about this, and one thing which I've said is that I selected several different Chinese articles and books about when Tibet became a part of China under the Mongols. Some say when the Yuan dynasty was founded. Some say when Sakyapandita went to Gudin's court. And there are one or two other different dates. In other words, they can't decide when it happened, and the reason they can't decide when it happened is because it never happened. There's no record. There's no record in which the Mongols said, okay, we're going to take this part of our empire and make it a part of China. And by the way, the Manchus did not do the same thing. Again, I set aside the priest-patron relationship because the priest-patron relationship can exist with political domination and without. And I think it's a bit of a red herring to go on and on and on about that. Clearly, at the end of the Qing, there was this idea about making Tibet a part of China. that meant that there was an understanding that it was not yet a part of China. And so you begin with the proposal, literally at the end of the Qing, that there should be a Xikang province, a province of Xikang. As you know, the Chinese name for Tibet is Xizang, so from that they just took the Xi, which means west, and attached it to the Chinese transcription of Kam. So they made Xikang, they proposed making Xikang province because you had to go through this process of assimilation, as it were, into China, but it hadn't happened. So there was this proposal to create a Xikang province at the very end. And of course, you know, the empire collapsed. The Qing Empire, the Manchu Empire collapsed before then. So I don't know if I've answered your question because I've gone off on so many tangents, but I'm sure people need to have dinner tonight, so I'll stop here. Yeah. Thank all of you. Thank you for coming.
Hasan Khan Mase Badurbat, Hulu Gibu, Matosum Dotas. This is Mudo Chingan Dotas. Zeta Chuyers Ladu, this is the Gibu Nila Chuyers Ladu, not looking to Jamatala. Yawamava Kushir Khan the Chuyers Ladu. Mala Chajaneva, Tito Trigger, Sumju Soviets Nerva. Çok düzle diyor. Arsalın diyor. Kuşiri kan diyor. Nasıl se Jungat Tito Diya Nigutaki Jungat Tame Sö. Dine sobu bir cebu kuşiri ki sedo çavuto yansa bir böyle cebu şey düzü ne aça. Dine şine tabi dine çıkı jajong magardo kole kele çıkı. Şine jarabın dünde düzü la. 아니 만주 공내기 두배 자나 용도 만주 말에게 생각하듯이 만주 공내 두배게 그런 말까지라 야종 말까 다 지도 되게 시기 신이네 소포 구실 칸도 아니 대봉 간데 보러 라브라 대바 이슈 코나바 정말 하루 버릇게 아니 마 터제 간데 보다 흉두스 사와도 타데 뭘 나자 참아 자사텔라 저가 먼저 인지 안머리 지가 먼저 먼저 mente 가디는 먼저 도르제니 가디나 먼저 문제요 봐 내 저가는 먼저 템스 콘스라네 먼저 도르제니 스타 다두 멘다 제가 간나 툭 그래서 뭐 아니 정말 터지게 띠가 보러 뒤에 쌈마 이런 거 뒤에 보러 봐. 되게 뒤도시에 또 맞아 보러 나가나 되게 최저다. 이게 대시에 양아가 있습니다. 내가 간데 보는 거 참 살이 제라 원수 로지는지 야택 첨부들 야택에서 가울에서 인진다 레지스터 첨부 되노나 고기 최저다 고기 렌즈도 정말 영향을 주요. 다 지도 두개 아니 나도 국주스 나 대박다 국주마 지도 두개 균지 전화나다 이렇게 기자를 찬네 별 농구 모두 기란 내가 가도라 연 영원에 가르치여를 막을 본도 도지네라 이놈이 최고시다 가서 맞아 제가 키 먹었지 양보지는 조금이나 내가요 가서 본도 숨었어요 그냥 내가 이제 비지나요 지다 다 다리 나오는 게 소불마 요요가 돼서 그러나 지도 된게 집들로라 아니 중간경마 별이요 아니 바사심 네 바사가 세 제로가 뒤도 네 가서 네 뒤집혀 뒤도 대사 센터 가서는 여대 소복이 꾸셔도 잡아 되게 자기 되게 아니 바사 루틴 나라 좀예다 제임지야다 꾸마이데 마쇼 건들 진짜 그게 나요 세카지 그러면 저는 사 പിന്നെ 중간에 망리전 뭐야 뭐잖아 그게 괜찮은 거는 다 와야 돼요. 근데 이게 이거다. 얼마 지금 그룹 중견도 저기 그 얼마나 또 소거든 내가 친구 이러나도. 다 지용이 흉한 게 즉석으로 뭐라 이거 되게더라. 얼마지. 밀리시아 생인데 유마스지. 다 얼마라도 막 야종망이나 나 때문에 되게 제망이나 막 전에라시라 가기면은 아니 유마 공부 유마에 망자 의상 그 말이 가지는 망자 의상 그네 공연 망자 컴스 오늘 카메라 얼마 마셔 진짜 가리래 계속 가도 돼요 그걸 어제 뒤에들 이 책이 좀 말해 계속 돼요 다 브라마게라 아마가 유마게라 유마니까 막 전시라라 하면 아니 호투도 대사센데 가서 묻어야지 아니 그셔도 되시요 내가 세마스 제가 유마 세마스 수부터 그랬어요 따라서 내가 잘 이해하는 따라서 로신의 뭔가 들어가 깨나서 이게 넘베 근데 참동되면 때도가 누군지 비시라 지금 소나는 시네
मेरी लेगा तो सब तुझे से शुरू नहीं मैं अभी ना यहाँ पैसे दिखे हुए सास ना तो पैसे लगे सुबह ना शेरे जितना खेबे के कोई न्यामशिप चेंगे रवा सोचो कि जो प्रोफेशन से दुआ तंगाई इस प्रोफेशन से तंगाई सिंह सुरे तेज़ा माइन बस सोचो मोने इंग योनी न्यामशिप चेंगे मिली खरी ना को छाछा में जब वो खेल युद्ध ओ पूरा दुआ समझ मज़ो समझ जब के दुआ तेज़ा तो लोग समझ चुके दिखे हुए हैं सिंह दिल लम्बी ट्रस 대실로 수행이나 공부 수행이나 다음에 개발 문에 세대 되면 이제 해요. 문에 내서 대대도와 세도와 어디 가도 로셔만 이제 미리 보고. 장구로 무슨 스페셜라이제이션스 미크로로 좀 거를 숨게 돼. 대마도 잡잡잡지에서 차고 라면만 보지 나한테 대인데 대기 라이 메딩이. 나도 공부 쪽이나 대 막미 제단스 계획도 들을 접지에서야 대체도 곧제도 되는 해도 등에 야데 나만 뭐 캔데 챙겨야 돼. 양고 이나에 이제 점이 줬어. 근데 이제 테스트 미크로로 좀 생각해 지금 도세. 니네 망상도 인터넷에 되게 망고 쉬우지 따이요다. 케바 코너스도 대시하고 망고 쉬우지 인터넷에 간 따이요다. 이 쪽들을 봐도 보면 되지. 그러와. 그 아메리카 흉도에 아메리카 흉랑이 제급 수수 가면 염집적인 케바 수 그래서 나라자 제급 세지 케베 좀 해도 쉬우와. 어디서 이거다. 가서 그랬다. 맞아 서로 있는 등에 필드 말에서는 이거 당에 필드 심어지러 왔다. 테스트하기로 와. 이 통도 와. 근데 이제 누수 도나치기나. 그러와. 이 이제 케바지 꼭도 먹었지. 근데 케바는 지내는 이걸 독주 제일 그러와. 이제 케바 고 먹었지. 케바 구글 얘기를 왔다 진짜. 어디서도 이제 도나치고 이제 세지 좀. 아니 니와디 뭐뭐 로카지 공 그런 숨게 난다지 폐. 숨게 되면 니는 나도 되게 되게 나도 단대디 President Archivist, authentic getting Tibet city, the engine of the Mongol Harbour Yama, the University Press publication is the Mongol Harbour Yama, to get on Yoko Yama. To do the indicated Juni, any egg to do get a Gilani, the land, and the Pebek, Tangavenes, that in a Karina to do politician, give up the Tebina Yoris, Jimmy to my Jana, land, the Dux Yore, and they pay the jury part and the transfer to you, the doctor, the love to do now. You didn't get the Thompson that way, your marriage like another jury. 내가 이제 말에 조금 고그로 야마라니 이제 전화제네 두두 가서 배전체네 이제 대대는 배전하니 부규 제사래 기대는 프로서 노예 이거를 제가 determine 거를 친다 콜라라사데 due to your inspiration I was able to do that authenticating Tibet 대직체 근데 다들 마음이 걸때 드린 그 수행나이 진짜 다시 라이브 근데 수행나게 해도 슬라비 Elliot Sperling 하고 이거래 제가 어제 이내 나랑 게 테스트 도나치게 배전하리나 베베게 하나 거리 토래 거리 매워 거리도 들려 도나치네 나가서 지내 나도 베베 마음이 걸때 히어라면도 삼으려지 좀 받다 수도 체인지 난다 너게 원들라게 대미 베마가 뒤도와 뒤에 뒤에 나도 단데 고소 막니 받는다 대충 크게 줘래 그래서 야마 나도 배워 체제네 대비게 상만 나도 벤저도 마 그래서 단위에 휴진 내담이 되었어요 이게 뭐 볼륨이요 요르데 도나생이 융융으로 공기 쳐보시라 말해도 융융 땅같이 하고 있다. 반지 요르게죠. 대만시다디야 지금에 망고지 시에 계시고 있어. 원룸인데 사선지 가는 교사. 나도 원룸집도 좀 제메마도 대습도 양대 리언다에. 들이 도나생이 요나 야나 뷰 가서 보다. 대화치도 만들 때 개발도 도. this deal, Sunday chapter with the Chasuti. In a moment, Mammy Corey, the Dichigo, you have so much anything about what Dichig US way. In a other, not to this stuff here, those who could see it. But I imagine I repent to you, and I'm going to let him not just some get to that name. Because the Luce and Russian Mongol Langadina, Quebec, and go to Vietnam. Because of the Indian inspires the simplicity of this year. And in order to prevent that providing that soon as soon as you invite history, a young way the careers and Konga said to check with their Dizamarwa. If they visit in a year, conveys Chinsha. 2 short conveys Chinsha. This song was done 2 short chain, 2 Massans to the town of Sweden, with her time, but the day that we in ancient history in the Janua. Today, in the Rinkirangi, as soon as he signature Kevin Yamyo, Natural Pigeon, a much with a low Mongota and the songs one, retired Chinsanet and the Mutiny Saving. Yana Dromisol and the Shade. This is the good dedicated in better sense, much of your girl. What did you dedicate in better sense in the natural area? They have me. What didn't get some complaints? Penzo, Tampo Penzo, Mount Build a dream, the Penzo of John and Kevin Charlie Mango, your rest. Take some Penzo to me attacking the doors. Get the symbols and the love you can the Korean, you're not the one who received their complaint, you know. So you can. And then I catch your Maran Casualty. Cartoons and Suji on the Kata, you could take over. Take care of Maranzo and get him over. Tell me some of the news as Kata. Tell me some of the news, Cartagena singing, taking of the Todam was the but you still care, and there's a rushing letter. This is the search around a manumatic there, oral history, the chick looks your. What do you think? Oh,